It began like so many stories that never should have ended in blood. A quiet street in South London, a young woman who wanted nothing more than the freedom to live and love on her own terms, and a family whose idea of honor would destroy everything. Banaz Mahmod's life was not supposed to be tragic, it was meant to be simple, ordinary, filled with the dreams of a 20-year-old woman who had finally begun to understand what happiness could look like. But in a world where culture and control collided, her laughter, her choices, and her love became unforgivable sins. Banaz grew up in a tightly knit Kurdish Iraqi family that had fled to the UK to escape the chaos of war. To her, London was supposed to be safety, a place where she could breathe. But the walls of her home were not the kind that kept danger out, they kept it in. Her father, Banaz Mahmod, ruled the household with the unyielding authority of a man clinging to old traditions. Honor, respect, obedience, these were not just words in their home, they were survival codes. Banaz had learned from a young age that her wishes meant little compared to what the community thought of her. When she was 17, she was married off to a man she barely knew. The marriage was meant to restore the family's reputation and strengthen their place within the Kurdish community in London. Her husband was older, controlling, and cruel. He hit her, insulted her, treated her like property. For 2 years, she tried to survive in silence, hiding her bruises, her shame, and her growing fear. But Banaz was not built to be silent forever. The world outside her home, friends, television, English voices that spoke of choice and independence whispered that there was another way to live. So one day, she made a decision that would cost her everything. She left him. Leaving wasn't simple. It was rebellion. It was a declaration that she no longer belonged to her family's rules. She returned home to her parents' house, hoping for understanding, but instead found fury. Her father saw her return as humiliation. To him, she had brought shame upon the family, and shame was a disease that needed to be cleansed. The whispers began spreading among the Kurdish community in South London. Men came to speak with her father, and Banaz noticed the way their voices lowered when she entered the room, the way their eyes carried judgment and threat. Her sister Bikal, who had already escaped the family and lived in hiding, warned her, "They will kill you, Banaz. They will never let you live freely." But love has its own way of ignoring danger. Around that time, Banaz met a man named Rahmat Suleimani. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and unlike the men she had grown up around. For the first time in her life, she laughed freely. They would walk through parks holding hands, talking about moving away, building a new life. But she knew deep down that every moment of happiness was being borrowed from a clock that was running out. She could see it in her father's face, in her mother's fearful silence, in the constant phone calls from relatives asking where she went and who she was with. Then came the threats. At first, they were warnings: don't go out, don't talk to him, don't be seen in public. Then they turned into more direct signs of danger. One night, Banaz was attacked outside her house by men from her own community. She ran, terrified, into a nearby cafe, shaking and sobbing, screaming that her family wanted her dead. The police came, took her statement, and let her go home. They didn't understand the weight of what she had told them. They thought it was a family argument. They didn't see the shadow of an honor killing forming right in front of them. In the weeks that followed, Banaz went to the police 5 separate times. Each time, she said the same thing: "My father is going to kill me." Each time, the reports were noted and filed away. Once, she even named the men she believed would carry out the killing. She gave their names, addresses, and the details of a meeting she had overheard where her death had been planned. Still, nothing was done. The system she believed would protect her simply didn't. The officers thought she was exaggerating or overreacting to cultural tensions. But Banaz wasn't paranoid, she was prophetic. On New Year's Eve 2005, Banaz went to her grandmother's house for a family gathering. Rahmat had dropped her off and promised to pick her up later. The evening was tense. Her father barely looked at her. Her uncle spoke to her in clipped tones. She tried to stay polite, quiet, invisible. But she could feel eyes on her every move. When midnight came, she hugged her grandmother and slipped out early, walking back into the cold night alone. Rahmat would later say he had a bad feeling that evening, an unease that wouldn't leave him. In the days that followed, Banaz told him about a meeting she overheard in her own living room. Her father and uncle had discussed her death, where, when, and how. They talked about cleaning the honor of the family, about removing the shame she had brought. She even wrote their names in a small notebook. "If anything happens to me," she told Rahmat, "it will be them." It was a chilling sentence, but Rahmat thought she might be overthinking. He couldn't imagine a father capable of such horror. But soon he would learn how wrong he was. On January 24, 2006, Banaz vanished. She stopped answering her phone, didn't show up to meet Rahmat, and didn't return home. He waited, called, messaged, nothing. Panic grew in his chest. He went to the police, telling them she was missing and that she had warned them this would happen. Again, they were slow to respond. It wasn't until days later that anyone began to take her disappearance seriously. What no one knew at the time was that on that cold January night, Banaz had been ambushed. Lured to her parents' house under the pretense of reconciliation, she was attacked, strangled, and tortured for hours. The men, relatives and members of her community beat her, raped her, and finally ended her life. Her killers were not strangers. They were the very people who claimed to love her, the ones who said they were protecting family honor. Her body was placed in a suitcase, stuffed into a car, and driven hundreds of miles away before being buried in a garden in Birmingham. It would take months before her body was found. Meanwhile, Rahmat continued his desperate search, haunted by the silence. He called the police again and again, begging them to look for her. Eventually, the truth began to unravel. Witnesses came forward. Phone records, surveillance footage, and whispers within the community led investigators to realize what had happened. When they finally found Banaz's body, she was so badly decomposed that identification took days. Yet even then, her story wasn't over, it was only beginning to speak. Because from the grave, Banaz would testify. Her recorded statements to police, her handwritten notes, her cries for help, everything she had said would become the evidence that exposed one of the most horrifying honor killings in modern British history. The girl everyone ignored had left behind her own voice, her own record, her own prophecy. By the time the arrests began, the story had reached national attention. The British public was horrified. How could a young woman, in a modern city like London, be hunted and killed for falling in love? How could a family carry out such cruelty in the name of pride? But for those who knew Banaz, the pain was personal. Her sister Bikal, living in hiding with a veil over her face for her own protection, would become one of the few family members brave enough to testify against their father and uncles. She would speak through tears, saying that Banaz had only wanted to live. And that simple wish had cost her her life. The trial would expose the dark underbelly of cultural control in immigrant communities, the unspoken fear of defying family traditions, and the tragic failure of the systems meant to protect women like Banaz. But in that moment, all anyone could feel was sorrow. A young woman's voice had been silenced but not erased. When the news of Banaz's disappearance began to spread, it was first treated like a missing person case, another name added to the list of young adults who might have run away. But for those who knew her, especially Rahmat, there was something different, something heavy in the air that felt final. He knew Banaz wouldn't just vanish. She had plans, dreams, messages left unread. She had even spoken of the future of a small flat they would rent together, far away from South London and the memories that haunted her. When she stopped answering, Rahmat's world fell into silence. The first days passed in chaos. He went from police station to police station, holding her photo, pleading with officers to listen. She said they were going to kill her, he told them again and again. She gave you names. The officers looked uncomfortable, flipping through reports that already existed. They saw her earlier complaints, her recorded statements, her previous visits where she had told them everything. And yet, somehow, they hadn't believed her. Now, it was too late to protect her, it was time to find her. In her family's neighborhood, a strange calm had settled. Her father Mahmod acted indifferent, telling people that his daughter had gone away or run off with her boyfriend. There were no search parties, no flyers, no desperation from the people who should have cared the most. Neighbors noticed how quiet the house was, how her mother avoided eye contact. Behind closed doors, the men spoke in coded words. "It's done," one said on a recorded phone call later uncovered by police. "The shame has been cleaned." Days turned into weeks. The Metropolitan Police's homicide unit began to take over, finally realizing that this was no ordinary disappearance. Detectives began interviewing those close to Banaz: friends, neighbors, community members. Many were terrified to speak. The fear of retribution in the Kurdish community was real and heavy. No one wanted to be labeled as the person who betrayed the family. Honor killings, though rare, were whispered about, the kind of dark secret that everyone knew existed but few dared to name aloud. When detectives interviewed Rahmat again, he broke down. He showed them messages Banaz had sent before she vanished. One read, "If anything happens to me, it's my family." In another, she wrote, "They want to kill me. They said it's decided." Her handwriting was steady, deliberate. It was like she had known her death was coming. Investigators finally began to piece together the story of a woman who had spent months begging for help. They visited her parents' home in Wimbledon, searching for clues. The house felt cold, lifeless, too clean. Her father answered questions with rehearsed calm, insisting she had gone off with some boy. Her mother sat silent, her eyes empty. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of Banaz. But in her bedroom, detectives found something haunting: a torn notebook page with a list of names and numbers. Among them were the same men Banaz had reported months earlier as her potential killers. It was her final attempt to leave behind the truth. Then came a break. A witness came forward anonymously, saying he had seen a group of men loading something heavy into a car outside the Mahmod home late one night. Another neighbor mentioned hearing strange noises: muffled cries, banging, whispers in Kurdish, then silence. The details were hazy, but the pattern was forming. The investigators began to believe what Banaz had tried so hard to tell them: her murder had been planned and carried out by her own family, with the help of their community. At the same time, Rahmat was called in for questioning again. They needed everything, every message, every moment he remembered. The guilt in his eyes was unbearable. "She told me they were going to kill her," he said. "I didn't think they really would. I thought we'd have time." The officers nodded, scribbling notes, but nothing could erase the feeling that they had failed her, that the warning signs had been there all along, ignored by a system that didn't understand the kind of danger that comes from within one's own bloodline. Months passed before the truth surfaced in fragments. One of the men involved began to boast about cleaning honor. He didn't realize that his phone was under surveillance. The conversations were chillingly casual, filled with laughter and pride. They spoke of taking care of the problem and finishing what had to be done. Those recordings would later become critical evidence, but for now, they were only beginning to understand how deep the conspiracy ran. In April 2006, after weeks of searching, police received a tip that led them to a quiet suburban home in Handsworth, Birmingham. The address belonged to an associate of Banaz's uncle. Officers arrived with search warrants, expecting little. But in the garden, under the damp earth, they found something large buried in plastic. When the soil was lifted, the smell hit them first: a mix of decay and gasoline. Beneath layers of dirt and debris lay a suitcase, heavy and sealed. Inside, they found what was left of Banaz Mahmod. Her body was decomposed beyond recognition. Time and weather had stripped her of identity, but dental records and DNA confirmed what Rahmat had feared from the start. The young woman who had begged for protection, who had written her own death note to the world, had been murdered and hidden like a secret. Detectives who worked the scene later said it was one of the most disturbing discoveries of their careers. She had been tied, beaten, and strangled before being packed into the case. The brutality was shocking, the intimacy of her killers even more so. When news broke that Banaz's body had been found, London froze. It wasn't just another murder, it was a mirror showing a side of society many didn't want to see. The press exploded with headlines about honor killings in Britain. People began asking how a young woman, in a modern, multicultural city, could die this way while police watched helplessly from the sidelines. For Rahmat, the news came like a knife. He sat in silence, tears running down his face, clutching the photo of her smiling, free, the way she should have remained forever. The arrests began soon after. Her father, Mahmod, and her uncle, Ari, were taken in first. Their faces were cold, detached, emotionless in police interviews. They denied everything. They said she had brought disgrace, that she had run off, that this was a community matter misunderstood by outsiders. But the evidence was building fast, phone records showing their coordination with the killers, car tracking data linking them to Birmingham, and statements from those too terrified to speak until now. Among the witnesses was Betrayal, Banaz's older sister. She had escaped the family years before after facing the same threats. Living under police protection, her identity was hidden behind a veil, even her voice disguised when she appeared on TV. When she learned her sister was gone, her guilt was unbearable. She had warned Banaz again and again to stay away from the family, to hide, to disappear like she had. But Banaz had wanted to believe that her father would never go that far. Betrayal knew better. They always said, she recalled later, if a woman disobeys, she must be taught a lesson. And Banaz was their lesson. As the investigation expanded, detectives uncovered a disturbing network of complicity. The murder had been ordered by her father and uncle, but carried out by others from the Kurdish community, men who believed they were restoring honor. They had tortured her for hours before ending her life. Some had fled the UK immediately after, traveling to Iraq to escape arrest. The police, determined to bring them to justice, launched one of the most complex international manhunts in British history. It would take years, but eventually, even those who ran would be found and brought back. In the middle of all of it stood Rahmat, the quiet man who had loved her. He was consumed by grief but also guilt. The police treated him with sympathy, but every time he saw their faces, he saw the faces of those who had ignored her cries for help. In interviews, he spoke about her gentle voice, her kindness, her fear. She told me she could hear them talking about it, he said. I told her to stay with me, to call the police. She said she already had. Those words haunted him for the rest of his life. The case became a storm. Feminist groups, human rights organizations, and the media called it a wake-up call for the country. For the first time, the UK was forced to confront the reality that honor-based violence wasn't just a foreign issue, it was happening quietly in its own cities. The police issued apologies for failing Banaz. Internal investigations began into how officers had dismissed her pleas. One officer, who had met her during an earlier report, publicly admitted he hadn't believed her story. She seemed calm, he said later, regret in his voice. I thought she was exaggerating. I didn't understand what she meant when she said her family would kill her. But Banaz had left behind more than a body. She had left behind her voice. In one of her earlier police interviews recorded months before her murder, she sat across from an officer, her hands folded nervously, and said, "They're going to kill me. I know it. My father, my uncle. I just want someone to listen. That recording, once ignored, became the most powerful piece of evidence in court. When it was played before the jury, the room fell into silence. Even hardened detectives felt their throats tighten. It was like hearing a ghost speak her own eulogy. The story of Banaz Mahmod was no longer just a private tragedy, it was a national reckoning. Communities across the UK began to debate the meaning of honor, culture, and control. But for those who had known her, no discussion could bring her back. She was gone, her smile erased, her laughter turned into evidence. Only the memories remained: the girl who loved freely, who wanted peace, who had the courage to defy a world that refused to let her live. The courtroom was silent when Banaz's name was first spoken. Her photograph sat projected on a large screen, a still image of her smiling softly, her eyes alive with hope. The people in the jury box shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the gentle face in front of them with the brutal story they were about to hear. The judge's voice echoed through the heavy air, formal and detached, yet even he couldn't hide the weight of what the case represented. This was not just the trial of a murder, it was the trial of a mindset, of a belief that a family's reputation was worth more than a woman's life. Banaz's father, Mahmod, and her uncle, Ari, sat motionless in the dock. Their faces were unreadable, carved in stone. Behind them, a translator whispered every word in Kurdish, though they barely acknowledged him. The prosecution began by describing the plan that had led to Banaz's death: the meetings, the phone calls, the decisions made in the quiet of their living room. They called it honor, the prosecutor said, but there is no honor in the torture and murder of a daughter. Those words rang across the courtroom like a bell tolling for something lost long before death. The evidence was overwhelming. There were phone records, bank withdrawals, and surveillance footage placing them near the site where Banaz's body had been buried. There were witnesses from within the Kurdish community who had finally decided to speak, despite the risk. And there was the most chilling evidence of all: the recorded police interviews where Banaz herself had predicted her death. When those tapes played, even the most hardened officers averted their eyes. Her voice filled the room, calm, frightened, resigned. My father is planning to kill me. My uncle is helping him. I just want someone to believe me. It was a cry from beyond the grave, and no one could claim they hadn't heard it now. But the heart of the trial, the part that everyone remembered, belonged to Bikal. The sister who had escaped years earlier, who lived under a new name, under constant protection, now returned to face the men who had destroyed her family. She walked into the courtroom wearing a black veil that covered her face entirely. Only her eyes were visible, and even they were shadowed by fear. The press called her the ghost witness, because she seemed half invisible, like someone who had already died once and come back to speak the truth. Her testimony was raw. She spoke about the years of abuse, the way their father had controlled every moment of their lives. She told the jury about Banaz's marriage, her divorce, the threats that followed. When she described how Banaz had begged their parents to let her live, the room fell into silence again. Bikal's voice trembled, but she never stopped. They said she had shamed them, she said. They said she had to be dealt with. I told her to run. I told her not to go back. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her courage didn't falter. For her, this was not just testimony, it was redemption. She couldn't save her sister's life, but she could help her win in death. The defense tried to discredit her, questioning her motives, implying she was bitter, rebellious, an unreliable daughter. But the jurors could see what was happening. They saw a woman haunted by loss, not revenge. When the cross-examination ended, Bikal stood up, turned her veiled face toward the men in the dock, and whispered one word: monsters. They didn't flinch. Outside the courtroom, the story had already become a national sensation. The media followed every twist of the trial. Television networks broadcast nightly updates, newspapers ran editorials demanding change, and people across Britain began to question what honor truly meant. Politicians debated laws on forced marriage and domestic violence, while activists demanded better protection for women at risk of cultural or family-based violence. But for those inside the courtroom, it was personal, immediate, and suffocating. Every detail that emerged made the horror more real. Detectives testified about the months of investigation, the coded phone calls they had intercepted, the witnesses they had convinced to come forward. One described the day they found Banaz's body, how her small frame had been folded into a suitcase, her hair still tangled around her face. The courtroom held its breath as he described that moment. "It wasn't just a body," he said quietly. "It was a story." You could feel everything that had happened to her in that one moment. Even the judge paused before allowing him to continue. But the trial didn't end with the convictions of Mahmod and Ari. There were others. Two of the main perpetrators, Mohammed Saleh Ali and Omar Hussein, had fled to Iraq immediately after Banaz's death. They thought they were safe, beyond British law, protected by distance and by silence. But Scotland Yard refused to let the case fade. In an unprecedented move, they launched a joint international operation to bring them back. It would become the UK's first ever extradition from Iraq. British detectives travelled across borders, working with Kurdish authorities, tracking the men through villages and safe houses. It took 4 years, but eventually, both were captured and flown back to London in handcuffs. When they arrived, they were defiant. Cameras caught them smiling as they were led into custody. But the bravado didn't last. In court, they listened to the evidence, the recordings, and the testimony, and the facade began to crumble. They were confronted with photos of Banaz before and after, the living girl and the dead one. The jurors saw everything. When the verdict came guilty, no one cheered. There was no sense of victory, only a heavy kind of justice that left everyone hollow. In the months that followed, more stories emerged from within the community. Other women came forward, anonymously, saying they had faced similar threats from their families for choosing their own partners. Banaz's case had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Social workers, police officers, and charities began working together to create better systems for identifying women at risk. They started to understand that honor-based violence wasn't about religion or ethnicity, it was about control, fear, and silence. It was about families who believed their reputation outweighed the lives of their daughters. Meanwhile, Bikal remained in hiding. She changed addresses constantly, never using her real name, always looking over her shoulder. In interviews, she spoke through a voice filter, her face hidden in shadow. She said she didn't want fame or pity, she wanted change. "If I stop talking," she said once, "then they've won. And I can't let them win. Banaz didn't die so quietly for me to live quietly." Her bravery became symbolic, a reminder that even in fear, there can be defiance. For Rahmat, justice brought little peace. He attended the trials quietly, sitting at the back of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together. He listened as strangers described the woman he loved, the way she had died, the things she had said before her final moments. Each word was another cut. When the verdicts were announced, he didn't celebrate. He simply lowered his head and whispered, "She told me." After the sentencing, he walked out into the cold London air and said nothing to the reporters waiting outside. There was nothing left to say. The love that had once made Banaz smile was now a wound that would never close. Years later, detectives still spoke about her case in interviews. One said it changed the way he saw policing forever. "We failed her," he admitted. "We were trained to see crime, not culture. We didn't understand the kind of terror that comes from inside your own family. Banaz taught us that we need to listen differently, to listen when someone says they're afraid of their own blood." That reflection became one of the case's most important legacies: training programs, new units, and changes in how the police respond to reports of family-based threats. But beyond the reforms and reports, the story of Banaz remained deeply human, a story of love crushed by control, of courage smothered by fear, of a voice that was ignored until it was too late. The documentaries that followed years later showed the quiet tragedy behind every frame. One, titled Banaz, A Love Story, told her story through Rahmat's eyes, combining his grief with her words. It was haunting, tender, and unbearable. People who watched it said they couldn't stop thinking about her, the girl who did everything right, who went to the police, who trusted the law, and still ended up in the ground. Even after the trials ended, threats lingered. Bikal lived with the knowledge that some in her community viewed her as a traitor, a woman who had destroyed her family's name by testifying. They don't see it as murder, she once said. They see it as punishment. They think they did the right thing. That was the true horror, the idea that her sister's death wasn't a crime to them, but a duty. The government began working with organizations to address forced marriages and so-called honor crimes. New laws were proposed, and awareness campaigns were launched. But progress was slow, and for every woman like Banaz who became a symbol, there were others still hidden, still afraid to speak. Her story became a warning, a name whispered by activists, teachers, and social workers whenever another young woman came forward saying she feared her family. As for Banaz herself, her grave became a quiet place of remembrance. Simple, unadorned, it bore only her name and the dates of her short life. Sometimes, flowers would appear there left anonymously, perhaps by Rahmat, perhaps by Bikal, perhaps by strangers who had heard her story and couldn't forget. In the soft soil of that grave lay more than a body, it held a nation's guilt, a reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored and love is treated like defiance. The story of Banaz Mahmod wasn't about one family, it was about every system that failed her, every voice that doubted her, every silence that allowed her killers to believe they were right. But it was also about resilience. Because even though her voice was silenced, her words still echoed through recordings, courtrooms, and hearts. "They're going to kill me," she had said. "I just want someone to listen." And now, at last, the world was listening. Years passed, but Banaz's name refused to fade. In London, where lives moved quickly and tragedies were replaced by new headlines every day, hers stayed. It lingered in classrooms, in police meetings, in government papers, in quiet conversations among women who had known fear too closely. Every time another case surfaced, another woman missing, another daughter found dead, the same question was asked: could this have been prevented if Banaz had been believed? Her story became a lesson written in grief. The police began using her case as training material for recruits. New officers sat in small rooms watching video clips of her interviews, the ones where she spoke softly but clearly about her father's threats. They watched her face, heard the desperation that had gone unnoticed, and learned what not to ignore. "This is Banaz Mahmod," the instructor would say. "She came to us 5 times. She warned us. And we didn't protect her. If you ever see this fear in someone's eyes, you listen." For many, it was the first time they understood what honor-based violence truly looked like, a quiet kind of terror, polite and pleading, hidden beneath family smiles. Charities began to grow around her name. Organizations like Karma Nirvana and Akro, Iranian and Kurdish women's rights organization, used her story to push for more support systems for women at risk. They held vigils each year, lighting candles not only for Banaz but for every woman whose family had become her prison. At one vigil in South London, a speaker said, "Banaz didn't die because of her culture. She died because of silence. Because people were too afraid or too polite to interfere." The crowd stood in silence, hundreds of candles flickering like broken stars in the dark. Bikal lived a life between worlds. She never stayed in one place for long. The protection unit moved her frequently, changing her names, her addresses, her numbers. She lived in plain apartments, often alone, always alert. At night, she'd check the locks 3 times before sleeping. Sometimes she dreamed of Banaz, not the body in the suitcase, but the sister who used to braid her hair, who whispered secrets and jokes when their father wasn't listening. In those dreams, they were back in their childhood room, laughing softly, as if time had never fractured. But the laughter always turned to crying, and she'd wake up trembling, unable to breathe. In her rare interviews, Bikel's voice carried both strength and exhaustion. She once said, "I have to live in the shadows because I told the truth. That's the cost. But I'd rather live in fear than live with the guilt of silence." She became a quiet figure of defiance, a reminder that speaking up against your own blood could be the bravest and most dangerous act of all. Even within her community, there were whispers that she should be punished for what she'd done. Yet she kept going, giving anonymous testimonies to journalists, helping organizations reach other women in similar danger. In every word she spoke, Banaz's name lived again. Rahmat tried to rebuild his life, but he carried a kind of loneliness that nothing could fill. He returned to work, surrounded himself with friends who tried to lift him out of grief, but it stayed with him like a shadow that never moved. He kept a small box of Banaz's belongings, photos, letters, a hair clip she once wore, a note she had written that said simply, "You make me feel safe." Sometimes, when the pain grew too heavy, he'd open that box, touch the things she'd once touched, and try to remember her laughter instead of her last words. For him, love had become both a memory and a wound. When the BBC released a documentary about her life years later, Rahmat agreed to participate, though it cost him every ounce of strength. Sitting in front of the camera, he spoke slowly, his voice breaking. "She was beautiful," he said. "Not just her face, her heart. She wanted a simple life. We just wanted to be together." He paused, struggling to continue. "They said we brought shame. But what kind of shame is love? What kind of man kills his daughter for being happy?" His grief reached through the screen, and viewers around the world cried with him. The documentary, Banaz, a love story, premiered on British television and later went international. It won awards, but more importantly, it sparked outrage and awareness. Schools started including honor-based abuse in their safeguarding lessons. Charities reported more calls from young women saying, "I saw Banaz's story, I think I'm in danger too. Her death had saved others." The thought was both comforting and cruel, that her suffering became a lifeline for strangers she'd never meet. In Parliament, new policies were drafted to protect women from forced marriage and family-based violence. Police departments created dedicated honor crime units, staffed by officers trained to recognize signs of control, isolation, and coercion. They learned to trust intuition over appearances, to see fear even when it came dressed in respect. One senior officer later said, "Before Banaz, we thought family meant safety. Now we know sometimes family is the danger." But for every step forward, there were still shadows. Honor killings didn't stop. They just hid deeper. Some families sent daughters abroad under the pretense of visits, only for them never to return. Others enforced silence through fear. But now, there was language to describe it, awareness to confront it. Whenever someone hesitated to believe a frightened young woman, someone else would say, "Remember Banaz." Her name had become shorthand for tragedy and warning. In South London, where she once lived, the street near her old house remained unchanged. People passed by every day, unaware of the ghost that lingered there. The house had new tenants, a family with children who played in the yard, their laughter erasing what once happened behind those walls. But sometimes, neighbors who remembered would stop and glance toward the window of her old room, where the lights used to stay on late at night. They said that even years later, they could still feel something, an echo of a young woman's fear and courage mixed together in the air. Her grave remained simple, without grandeur. Bikel and Rahmat never visited together, too dangerous, too public, but both came separately when they could. Bikel always brought white lilies, Rahmat brought roses. Each time they left flowers, someone would later find them replaced by fresh ones, left by someone else unknown. She had touched more lives than she could have imagined. People who had never met her now saw her as a sister, a daughter, a friend, a symbol of what must never happen again. As the years went on, journalists revisited her case in anniversary reports. They spoke to the detectives who had worked it, the prosecutors who had fought for justice, and the activists who had turned her story into change. One of the detectives said, "When I retire, hers will still be the case I think about. Because she looked at us, right in the eyes, and told us what was coming. And we didn't listen. That haunts me." Another said, "She taught us humanity. Every time I interview a scared girl now, I see Banaz's face in front of me." Even in Iraq, where her killers were originally caught, her case caused ripples. Human rights organizations there began quietly addressing the issue of honor killings within Kurdish communities. Though progress was slow, awareness had begun to grow. People began asking difficult questions about pride, about control, about what it really meant to protect family honor. Change was fragile, but it was beginning to exist where once there had only been silence. Bikal grew older living under protection, but never free. Her real identity erased, her past hidden behind false documents, she sometimes wondered if she had survived at all. "I'm alive," she said in one rare interview, "but not really living. Every day is borrowed. But I tell Banaz's story because that's all I can give her now. I don't have family, I don't have peace. All I have is her memory." Her words were quiet, but they struck like thunder. Sometimes, she'd replay her last conversation with Banaz in her head, the phone call where Banaz had said she was going back home because her parents promised forgiveness. Bikal had begged her not to. "Don't go," she'd said. "They won't forgive. They'll kill you." Banaz had laughed softly, trying to believe in hope. "They're still my family," she had replied. "Maybe they've changed." But they hadn't. And that hope had cost her her life. That memory haunted Bikal more than anything else. She said if she could go back in time, she would have broken into the house herself, dragged her sister away by force. But time offered no mercy. For Rahmath, the years didn't dull the pain, only changed its shape. He eventually moved to another city, trying to escape the memories, but they followed him everywhere. He once said that every time he saw a girl laughing in a cafe, or holding her boyfriend's hand on the street, he thought of Banaz. She wanted to live like that, he said. Free. Happy. She never got the chance. He still kept her photos, one in particular, where she was looking away from the camera, smiling at something unseen. "That's how I remember her," he said. Not as a victim. As someone alive. Banaz's story became part of school curriculums, shown to social workers, law students, and teachers. Her case was cited in academic papers, documentaries, and awareness campaigns across Europe. Her voice, the recordings she made before her death, became a haunting reminder of what happens when victims are dismissed. "They're going to kill me," she had said. "I just want someone to listen." Those words appeared on posters, in advocacy videos, in conference halls. They had become immortal, carved into the conscience of a society that had failed her once and vowed not to again. But the truth was, even with all the change, her loss never fully healed. Some wounds stay open not because they can't close, but because they remind us not to forget. The tragedy of Banaz Mahmod was not only that she died, it was that she saw her death coming, begged for help, and no one believed her until it was too late. Yet from that unbearable reality came something larger: awareness, laws, courage in other women who once would have stayed silent. In that sense, she won a quiet victory that her killers could never erase. Late one autumn, years after the final trial, a small memorial was held in her name. No cameras, no press, just a few people who had known her or been touched by her story. They stood in a circle around a candle light, the air cold and still. A speaker read out her name slowly, and for a few moments, there was only silence. Then Bikel's voice came from behind her veil, trembling but steady. "She was my sister," she said. "She was kind. She was brave. And she deserved to live." There were tears, but also something else, a feeling that in remembering her, they were giving her the life she had been denied. As the candles burned lower, the wind picked up, scattering petals from the flowers laid nearby. Someone whispered, "Rest now, Banaz." The flames flickered, but didn't go out. Because her story still burns quietly in every woman who dares to speak, in every officer who chooses to listen, and in every person who understands that honor should never be stronger than love.